Welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. We are starting now the second session for this last day. The topic of the session is future generation and impact of today's PPPs. In our Congress this year, we are exploring how future-proof PPPs can tackle expansive challenges of our time. As head of the Young PPP Professional Chapter, I'm dedicating this session to address the global challenge young professionals are facing, the skills gap. Our youth will be the ones to build a better, more sustainable world, but they need access to the tools, education, and opportunity to make the change. How PPPs and private sector participation can create impactful initiatives that will shape the youth future and sustainable growth. We have a great panel with us today to address these issues, share their experience, and to present ongoing programs. Let me introduce them. We have Max McCabe. Max is the Chief Operating Officer at the Education Outcome Fund. He is based in London. EOF is a UN-hosted fund dedicated to improving education, employment outcomes for 10 million children and youth globally. Max is also working with a union of leaders from education, climate, politics, and business to develop a movement in the intersection of education and climate to harness education's power to fight climate change. Welcome, Max. We have Siria Taurelli. She is the coordinator of skills system governance and quality assurance at the European Training Foundation, ETF, and based in Italy. Syria and her team launched the Governance Learning Action and Dialogues, the GLAD network, to assess and act upon system-level conditions for lifelong learning, including multi-actor and multi-level coordination, role of social partners and civil society and organization. She is one of public. She is. I'm sorry. She's the author of Public-Private Partnerships for Skills Development. Welcome, Syria. And last, we have Antoine Polo. He is the program manager at the Africa Infrastructure Fellowship Program, and he is based in France. He joined the AIFP to reinforce the staff and to lead the 2022 fellowship program. He has worked also successfully with the private sector in Mali, the United Nations, as well as the French Treasury. Welcome everyone, and welcome to our audience joining us today. Please feel free to chat and also use the Q&A box to post your questions. At the end of the session, we have a short Q&A to address your questions. We will start the presentation with two presentations actually. The first from Max and then Syria to introduce PPPs in skills development and explain how partnerships may support the SDG 4, the education, and SDG 8, the access to decent work and economic growth targets. So over to you, Max.
Wonderful. Thanks, Janine, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to try and share my screen, so if you just bear with me for a moment. Janine, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. Okay, so over the next few minutes, I want to talk to you all about how we're thinking about PPPs in education. And when we think about PPPs, we are trying to reframe them away from towards partnerships for public purpose. And we think this is going to be a critical part of the solution to meeting SDG 4 of equality education for all. So before I get into the detail of how we actually approach these programs, I want to set the scene a little bit about the challenges we face in the education sector. So there is a huge spending gap to what we need to deliver on SDG 4 of equality education for all by 2030. So the Education Commission at the UN estimates this gap to be around $33 billion. So a massive gap to what's needed. And if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see how far off we are from delivering a quality education from all. So in low and middle income countries, this is particularly acute. So we see only a very small fraction of children and young people are getting the education they deserve. And this has been, as I'm sure you'll imagine, massively exacerbated by COVID. Currently, in lower middle income countries, 70% of children are leaving school in what the World Bank calls learning poverty. This is being unable to read a simple sentence for meaning or conduct basic numeracy. So 70% of children are leaving school without even a basic level of education. So huge change is needed. We need to mobilize significant additional funding for education, but we have an additional problem. And this is that spending doesn't always lead to an increased level of learning. So we need more money, but we also need to ensure that the money that we already have is being spent in the best way possible and is delivering the best possible impact that it can. If we look at this at a program level, the UK government and the World Bank conducted a kind of large-scale study of education programs and the impact they were having. And the evidence that they found was that in lower middle income countries, half of all programs that were evaluated, and not all programs were evaluated, but half of them that were, have no impact on learning outcomes. So a huge proportion of the programs that are delivered with the best intentions are actually not creating the impact and having the result that they are targeting. In skills development, the problem's even worse. So the World Bank did a meta study of labour market programs and showed that 2/3 have no impact on employment and earning outcomes. So again, a massive proportion of the programs are not having the impact they desire. This is both a huge waste of money, but also a massive waste in opportunity. And then if we look at a macro level, there's a massive variation on the impact of every dollar spent in education. So for every $100 spent in low-income countries, the years of learning, this is a measure it's used in education, the years of learning, varies from 1 to 4. So again, there's this huge variation in the efficiency of spending and how spending is actually translating into the thing that we care about, improvements in learning or improvements in employment outcomes. So we need to make sure we're effectively translating both domestic budgets and development financing into the greatest learning outcomes that we could, with a focus on the most marginalized. And this is where the Education Outcomes Fund is using innovative financing techniques, new forms of partnerships to help drive efficiencies and improve the quality of learning. On the left-hand side here of the slide, you can see how much innovative finance is being used in the energy and health sectors, and yet how relatively little amount of funding has been leveraged in the education sector. So this is what EOF exists to shift, to use outcomes funding, a form of results-based financing, a new form of partnership between the public and private sectors, third sector NGOs, CSOs, to improve the quality of learning around the world. So we think this can achieve results and improve the quality of learning in a number of different ways. So one of which is around having a very clear view of success and shifting a focus and accountability onto that success. It also creates a huge amount of evidence about what works, and really importantly, at what cost. And this is something that's often missing in the education space, is a clear view of both impact and the cost to achieve that impact. And so through these new forms of partnerships, leveraging innovative finance, we can generate a huge amount of evidence that we can then use to scale programs. And finally, we can target specific groups. So in education, girls are often underserviced. So actually, through results-based financing mechanisms, we can force a spotlight onto groups that are traditionally underserved. So girls or refugees, children with disabilities. So again, it's about using a financial mechanism and a new form of partnership to really focus on groups that are traditionally underserved. So I want to give one example of a program that we've launched. This is a program we've launched in Sierra Leone. This is an outcomes fund in partnership with the government. So here we've received funding from the government of Sierra Leone, and this is a very important part of our model, ensure we're building in the sustainability and have real, genuine government buy-in is by having host countries contribute to the funds. But alongside that, we have a suite of international donors who put in around $20 million to support the quality of learning in Sierra Leone. So they're going to be working in about 325 schools over 3 years. These are government primary schools that are broken into 5 different lots, and there'll be a different service provider or coalition of service providers working to support these schools, or each of these lots of schools. These schools will be supported by these service providers, and then we'll conduct an annual randomized control trial, really trying to understand the impact of the interventions in each of these schools, and then we will pay providers directly in proportion to the improvements in learning. And in this case, it's improvements in numeracy and literacy in these schools. And in this program, again, we want to force a focus on girls' education. So we're paying a 1.2 times multiple for the outcomes that girls achieve. This is because of the additional resources that is needed to focus on a traditionally underserviced group. So the benefits of this approach, well, we see a huge amount of positive effects of this way of funding and designing education programs, this new form of partnership versus traditional input-based approaches. So we create a huge amount of evidence about what works in the Sierra Leonean context. And in this program, we're then going to be, because we're partnering with government's going to take the most effective interventions and scale them across the whole of the education system. We're also, as I've said a few times, having this new form of partnership, this partnership for public purpose, where we can use the innovation, the creativity of non-state actors, be it social enterprises, NGOs, CSOs, but all of it under the guidance of government, and to support the quality of education in government primary schools. So using the power of the private sector, but with a strong equity focus. And then finally, we're transferring the risk to the private sector. So the donors and the government of Sierra Leone are only paying for the results achieved. So if there's underperformance, if outcomes and impact are not as planned, then the risk is borne by the private sector, the organizations that are working in these schools. And when we first started designing this program, there was a lot of skepticism about whether we'd be able to raise the investment capital that we needed to launch this program. But actually, we were hugely oversubscribed. We had 3 times the amount of capital and 3 times the amount of service providers that were willing to work, even in an environment as challenging as Sierra Leone, demonstrating there's a huge kind of latent demand for these types of programs, huge amount of capital that wants to be put to work to deliver social outcomes, and a huge number of social enterprises and NGOs and CSOs that want to be working in this way. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of our work, but I'll hand back to Janelle.
Well, thank you, Max. We'll have a discussion about that, but now I'd like to have the floor to Celia, to give the floor to Celia for her presentation.
Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm also going to share my screen. I have a very short presentation, and I hope you can see it now. Can you give me a sign because I don't see you?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. My presentation actually follows quite well after Max's own introduction and presentation. And what I want to start with is the fact that in public-private partnerships in the field of skills development, we should take a notion of PPP or definition which goes beyond the traditional definition. When we speak about PPPs, internationally, we refer to contracts. By and large, in essence, PPPs are about how a contract is defined, and the aim is the delivery of a service, of an infrastructure. In the field of skills development, and I will explain why, we should refer to a more extended notion which we have at European Training Foundation named as a mechanism for coordinating actions and sharing responsibility. This is important, sharing responsibility between public and private stakeholders, with a view to formulating, designing, financing, managing, and sustaining common projects, common engagement. So it goes beyond. Then here the accent is also on the fact that the public and private sides, they start the project or define the project together from the very beginning, from the formulation. So there is a continuous cooperation that builds throughout the unfolding of the PPP in the field of skills development. So there's more than a contract, and we'll see also that later. There is more than a preoccupation for efficiency of spending. What are these PPPs? And here I want to refer again to a study that European Training Foundation conducted in 14 countries and based on 23 different case studies of public-private partnerships in the field of skills development. And what we found is that there is a big diversity. These PPPs are all diverse. It's not that easy, and perhaps it's not even that necessary to create a strict typology. But if we do so, we have to take into account at least 3 dimensions. One is the purpose. What is the so-called functional family? What are they doing? And here we have three types, 3 possibilities. PPPs that focus mainly on knowledge. For example, these are PPPs that concentrate on skills analysis, skills anticipation, try to figure out what are the training needs for the future. So skills intelligence. They can also, other PPPs, they mainly focus on the provision of vocational education and training, skills, programs, and so on. And they are the majority. The typical example are the PPP that are created in the context of work-based learning, where a school or more than a school and a company or more than a company, they agree on how the practical side of the training can be provided at the company or with the support of the company. And last but not least, we have the resource-oriented, and these are the PPPs that focus on the infrastructure, refurbishing a training center, providing laboratory equipment, and so on. But the other dimensions are also important. How far are these PPP part of the skill systems in a given country? Are they completely recognized? Are they the normal in the system? Or on the other hand, are they isolated cases, experimental or pilot initiative ad hoc? So here we have different options. And last but not least, but very typical of PPPs in the field of skills, is the type of memberships. The majority of the case studies we have analyzed, they're open. The partnership are open to new partners who can join at a later stage. And this, again, with that, we see once more that, this type of PPPs in the field of skills, they are a bit away from the classical PPP, where you have a contract, and in the contract stipulates who are the parties, and basically they don't really change over time. Whereas here we have more opening. So different dimensions. One dimension alone would not suffice to, say, define or identify what type of PPP are we talking about. Now going to the main question of Jinan and the main question of the session, how far these PPPs relate to sustainable development goals, and can they relate to sustainable development goals? Well, here I try to, there is a lot of writing in these slides, but what it shows is that if we take the Sustainable Development 4 on quality education for all and Sustainable Development Goal number 8 on fair employment and good quality employment, we need to connect one to the other. And we know that in the Agenda 2030s, we have two goals, number 16 and number 17, that are horizontal, and they are necessary for all other goals, including the goal on education and the goal on employment, to be achieved. The number 17 is about partnership, so it's very close to our heart today and to the content of this conversation, of this whole Congress. And actually, the Sustainable Development Goal has several, number 17 on partnership has several targets. And one of the targets really stipulates that public and private sector and civil society, they can and they should work together in order to enable better education and better employment and more employment. I'm not going to read all these different options, but I take just one. For example, SDG 4.3, I mean, the target number 3 reads equal access for all to affordable and quality technical, vocational and tertiary education, including at the university level. And if we try to see how does it match with the target 5 in the development goal on employment, which reads full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including for young people and persons with disability. So how can these two, equal access to quality technical and vocational education, skills development, and full and productive employment and decent work for everyone, how can they match? Well, one possibility is that the public and private, they work together in order to facilitate school to work transition, to enable a young graduate, a young student, a young person to find good employment at the end of the school time after graduation, and so on and so forth. And this has very often to do with options for good quality apprenticeships, work-based learning, internships, but they need to be designed together. So we go back to the definition or initial definition, which I've sketched at the beginning, a mechanism through which the public and private side, they design together the joint project. They identify together the implementation modalities, and they cooperate, they share responsibilities for implementation. So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to match PPPs and sustainable future, we have to look on how the partnerships are designed, how the partnerships are implemented, and what are the drive for these partnerships. And what we found in the ETF study, I hope I've been able to stop sharing, was that in this type of PPPs, again, the case studies we have analyzed, the main reason and the main drive of the PPP was motivation for skills. It was not necessarily effective or efficient spending. That was not the main driver for the public, but even for the private sector. In countries or in local situations where there is skill shortages, companies are ready to invest in skills. And when they bring their expertise and capacity together with the public sector, then a PPP is successful. And what we mean by successful, it's really looking at the benefits for the learners. This, at the end, the best and unique criteria to define the successfulness of a PPP, how far the outcomes have been achieved and what are the outcomes. The outcomes are good quality skills, good opportunity for employment for the learners. And I stop here for the moment. Thank you, Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Syria. Thank you for the presentation. And indeed, I guess that the main driver is the motivation from the public sector, from the private partners, from the NGOs, and also from the youth. Because, I mean, I guess they are defining what they need, what they want, where do they feel they have the gap. And I mean, as we all know here in public-private partnerships in infrastructure, we have the private partner and the public. But since you are like in ETF and you've been like really involved in skills development PPPs, I mean, we always see in this type of PPPs, the public, the private, and also the presence of NGOs and civil societies. Can you please Syria, elaborate a little bit on this like triangular relation between the three entities, and also what each sector bring, or what is the motivation of each sector?
Sure. This triangular relationship is very important. And in fact, it corresponds to reality. I mean, when we look at this type of PPPs in the field of skills, it's not rare to find triangular relations, public, private, and civil society. In this relationship, the government remains eventually accountable for the outcomes, for the quality of the education, but also the quantity, because there is often, and we are discussing also about that issue of access to education. So how far the programs, the policies and the programs are able to increase the access and successful participation of everyone in education and training opportunities. So there's more of responsibility for the government compared to just procuring or delegating a service. There is an accountability that holds strong in the public end side. The private sector is essential if we consider that skills development also is a continuum. It starts at schools, where companies may contribute to spaces for practical learning. They can provide a mentor for young trainees, but skills development continues throughout life. So during employment at the company, continuous skills development is important, and private sector has a major responsibilities there. It happens actually more than we see. It's not that visible in statistics, but we know from surveys that most of the adult learning or adult skills development takes place at the workplace. However, this is not evenly distributed. We know that certain categories of employees benefit much more than others about skills development. So that there is something to be done there. Anyhow, if we now move to the civil society organization, we shall also speak about innovation. This is very often a contribution they bring to the partnership, innovative approaches, advanced approaches, experimental approaches. A second very important benefit of involving civil society is the fact that these organizations are very often able to reach out population groups that would not access formal education, that would not go to a public employment service. They would refrain from, or they would find obstacles to access existing services. With civil society organizations, these people very often they are able to be on board. And third and last but not least, the civil society organizations are often playing the role of a mediator or a broker between public and private sector. They're able to speak the language and understand the viewpoint of both sides, so they are able to facilitate agreements, to find solutions to problems. So the fact of having these triangular relations really creates a space which is outside the public, outside the private, outside the civil society, where they together can do things that would not be able to do on their own.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sia. I mean, this explains all at the end. And now I have a question for Max. Since you're working now on skills development PPPs, and you talked a lot about outcomes. I have a question about outcomes. Now, when we measure outputs and infrastructure PPPs, these are clear based on pre-agreed specifications and so on. So how do we measure outcomes in education? And we all now have maybe a question about the time frame. I mean, these are not immediate results we can see. So can you please just explain a bit more about this mechanism for measuring outcomes?
Yeah, of course. And it is the million-dollar question when it comes to education PPPs. I think the first thing to consider is how we kind of understand the outcomes that we're going to be targeting. Like in physical capital development, it's easy to see whether a road has been built or a bridge has been constructed. In human capital development, it's a lot harder, both in terms of how to measure what level of success has been achieved, but also just what success looks like. What is good for a 3-year program supporting the quality of learning in Sierra Leonean primary schools? For us, we start off with a deep partnership with government. Ultimately, the education ministry of every country is and should always be the overall steward of education in that country. So we need a deep partnership with government to understand what their priorities are. We operate to serve government priorities. We then need to understand, if we have these high-level priorities around improving numeracy and literacy in primary school, as an example, we then need to ensure that all the different parties that are going to be involved in a program are sat around the table, helping to contribute to our understanding of success. So that can be government, it could be the private sector, investors, it can be civil society organizations, school leaders, educators, getting people to sit around a table and really think through what we are going to achieve through a program. And often these actors aren't used to sitting around a table together. And it can lead to quite a long, there's a question around sort of time to design these programs in the chat. It can be a longer kind of design process, because you've got to have these difficult conversations where you need to really understand what has worked in the past and also what hasn't worked. What is it going to cost to improve learning? What is the evidence that currently exists? What are the gaps in the evidence that we need to be trying to address through the program? But this process of getting all the parties aligned around what is the impact we're going to be targeting means that you have this collective responsibility for success. Everyone is clearly aligned about what you're targeting in the program, and also clearly aligned around who's going to be held accountable for achieving this success. So often in programs, these conversations have to happen, but instead of happening up front, they happen through the program's life cycle, or perhaps just at the end of the program. If you just evaluate at the end, suddenly you can realize that the different organizations, different stakeholders had a different view of what they're targeting. So for us, getting this process of really understanding what success looks like, what the impact is that we're going to target, is critically important. And then the Education Outcomes Fund, well, we're a specialist in this space. So we need to then think about, okay, how do we manage for potential perverse incentives? How do we ensure that absolutely no harm can come as a result of a program? How do we make sure that we're building an accurate evaluation methodology that all the different parties are going to subscribe to, and that we're confident that we can attach payment to? Like ultimately, we're paying on the basis of the evaluations. So it's critical that these are both accurate and give a high degree of attribution. So you understand that the improvements in learning are as a result of these activities, this work that an NGO has done with a school, rather than some other factors. And then when we think about evaluations, we want to have both evaluations at kind of points in time at the end of each year, perhaps, that will attach payment to. But we also want to ensure there's active performance management over the life cycle of a program. We want there to be we want our programs to be data-driven and adaptive, so that if an assumption around what is going to work and deliver outcomes isn't having the impact that is desired, there is this space for educators, space for NGOs, CSOs to pivot, to change their activities, to respond to the actual realities on the ground, which for us is a really important part of this model, is that we're not saying here's a rigid work plan you have to stick to for 3 years or 5 years. Instead, we're saying you're going to be held accountable for the outcomes you achieve, and that creates a greater space for changing, for responding to the real world. And we saw this a lot through COVID, right? Suddenly all schools closed across the world. Rigid programs really struggled to adapt. But when you hold people accountable to outcomes, then people have the space to change as a result. And at the end, we ensure accountability by having these sort of, by holding very strong evaluations and then attaching payment to those.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Max. Now we're going to move to Pierre-Antoine. He's going to showcase the fellowship program he's working on. So basically, this program is for civil servants in the PPP field. So over to you, Pierre.
Thank you, Jinan. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Max and Sarah, for this interesting conversation. I'm going to try to show you my presentation too. Here we go. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to present you the Africa Infrastructure Fellowship Program Initiative with a focus on Africa, as you can imagine. First of all, what is the IFP? The IFP was created from one initial observation that it exists a huge gap between African infrastructure needs and the resources available to address that need. Indeed, according to the African Development Bank, the African continent has infrastructure needs that culminate to around 130 billion to 117 per year, while the financing gap ranges between 68 to 108 billion per year. Despite needs still not being met, investment in terms of infrastructure in Africa have been growing steadily in the last 15 years. The effort to close the infrastructure gap are illustrated by the 2018 Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, which showed that between 2013 and 2018, in Africa, $77 billion was spent on average annually for the funding of infrastructure. The issue is not the lack of interest in financing infrastructure on the continent, but this project rarely arrive at the financial inclusive step. As such, 80% of projects fail at the feasibility or business plan stage. According to the private sector and the professional, it is explained by weak administration and a deficient legal framework. They also believe that one of the main obstacles to the deployment of infrastructure on the African continent is the lack of training of technical expertise and public procurement specialists in infrastructure. That's why we came to the IFP. To tackle this issue, an approach merging public and private sector was fostered. It's in this context that the IFP was launched by the Global Infrastructure Hub, by Meridiam and the World Economic Forum of Davos. The IFP aims at bringing together actors and practitioners from the public and the private sectors to provide a high-level training program for African civil servants in the domain, of course, of infrastructure and PPP. As a result, the IFP was finally established in 2019. Since then, many partners have joined the initiative, like the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Islamic Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, the Société Générale, or COLAS, like mixed with public and private partners. We have at the IFP some goals with very strong objectives. The main topic, of course, is to train the next generation of African procurement experts. This training program, which is free for its participants and reserved for African civil servants, has several objectives. Obviously, it's about training them in the domain of infrastructure of PPP. That's the main topic. But we want to offer a unique approach to disseminating practical knowledge, sharing expertise, and cooperation between the private and the public sector. That's really the specificity of this program. And we want a project with a tangible social and economic impact on communities. We also want to stimulate cooperation with PPP unit with our alumni network to share good practices and success stories that they can meet. The initiative has this virtue to bring together professionals from all over Africa who are faced with similar issues in similar contexts, people who almost never talk to each other in normal time. Thanks to this alumni network, the fellow will be able to share knowledge and challenges between them, but also with international PPP, public-private partnership specialists, such as the one present here in the WAPPP, or those they meet during the program where they're in Paris. How it's working. So I'm going to present you the program structure. The program starts with a 3-week-long academic training to understand the role of the private sector investment in infrastructure. During this intensive course, the fellow will be able to receive academic teaching by public procurement experts to cover the overall responsibility in an infrastructure project, from initial planning to closing. It could be infrastructure prioritization, framework, PPP selection, preparation, risk allocation. And across, of course, a variety of sectors like transportation, energy, social, waste, and water. And in parallel with this academic training, they're going to participate to a workshop with senior institutional public and private partners such as the MEGA or the IFC, which they're really appreciated by the fellow, actually. The second part of this preparation is a formal accreditation from the World Bank to be certified. The fellow prepare and pass the first 2-level foundation and preparation of the APMG Public-Private Partnership Certification Program. This examination is really crucial for us because this certification was established to create a common level of knowledge and understanding among participants in the PPP sector. So it's really the certification part of the program. And finally, the third and final part of this program is the immersion part, during which the fellow can finally apply the theoretical knowledge acquired during the master class in a concrete way through practical cases. They join actually a professional organization for a kind of internship. The fellow carry out their professional immersion in different entities ranging from technical, legal, financial, consulting firm, investment fund. So it's according, of course, to their background and their interest. Who can be an IFP fellow? As we want to select public civil servants that will benefit the most to their own state, that's really the spirit of the program, the IFP put in place a very clear and transparent criteria for the applicant during the selection process. The conditions are minimum of 3 years of practical experience in infrastructure or PPP. Candidates may obtain the endorsement of their organization or hierarchy. That's obvious. It's only, of course, for civil servants that plan to work on a long-term basis in the public sector. And they have to take a moral commitment to serve the public sector for a minimum 2 years after the training. And they need a reasonable command of English because it's necessary to follow the program. Let's have a look on the 2021 cohort. The first cohort mostly could take place mostly in a regular sanitary situation, because we all know that the COVID impact all this kind of initiative. After the first fellowship program that we had in 2020 and months of preparation, we welcome in last October and November the 2021 cohort. You can see them on this slide with the former French Minister Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne. So let's have a look on the geographical origin of the applicant. Thanks to this, the pilot class of 2020, the last edition of the IFP has raised the interest of nearly 127 candidates from 23 countries through the African continent. From these 23 countries, 12 were French-speaking, 8 were English-speaking, and 3 were Portuguese-speaking. Compared to the first cohort, the candidacy originated from 18 additional countries. Most applications came from sub-Saharan Africa. Despite offering a program in English, in the international aspect of the program was utterly understood, with more than half of the application coming from non-English speaking countries, even if the program is fully in English. We also have diversity in the profile, the candidate profile. Sorry, the IFP was able to raise interest in a wide spectrum of participants. Actually, we were fortunate to receive application from men and women. On the year 2021, it was 24% of women. I think in the current selection process, we reached 36%, I think. So it's getting higher. But we also have disparate ages ranging from 26 years old to 61 years old, with an average of 37 years old. So that's pretty young. And there was also a wide variety in the institution and profession represented. We had application from central administration, public agencies, from contrasting positions such as engineer, economist, lawyer, architect, political actor. So really all the step in a PPP or infrastructure project. On the cohort itself, the final cohort, the IFP aimed to being as representative as possible. The last cohort was composed of 18 different nationalities. It was gender equal, with 12 women and 11 men, with an average age of 39 years old. It incorporated middle to high manager profile, as well as highly promising young individual in very distinct occupation. That was really great for the promotion. And you can imagine there is an interest growing in this program, and the perspective now is to share the program the most. You have received for the current selection process a remarkably high number of applications from several new countries all over the continent, with only an extremely limited number of spots, because the program is, of course, very expensive. And our challenge now is to answer to a growing demand for training African administration with our tools. That's why we want to open. You can see it on this slide. We want to open to a wider audience by diversifying our offer to virtual classes, to shorter sessions, or delocalized training in targeted African countries with very high demand. But I'm coming on the outcome of the program, because it's the topic of the day. And you can imagine, and you have to keep in mind that the program is noticeably young, only 2 years old, with only one session that took place in a normal condition. It's extremely hard to evaluate the direct outcome of the training, especially because all these projects are based on a very long-term perspective. However, with a base of 18 countries and 33 fellows, we have developed a small network of alumni with the objective to exchanging experience and best practice among them. I'm glad to see that they continue to share with each other and ask for advice. We also try on our side to continue to support them by connecting them with PPP professionals in specific area when they request it, when they face a situation, for example. And also about their future training, they want to attend like the last level of PMG certification. There is obviously a life after the program, and our work does not stop when they finish it. I think I'm done. I just put here my contact if needed, but
yes. Well, thank you, Pierre. Before moving to the questions, I have a very quick question. As you mentioned that this program is for civil servants, and the objective is to support like the African governments. Is there some sort of like a pre-agreement with the governments to like, I mean, how do you guarantee that these fellows will stay working with the public sector? I mean, you need to like sustain the success of your program as well. I mean, and not having them like shift to the private sector.
Okay. Obviously, the temptation to leave their job for a new position is an issue. The goal is not to dispense this training for people to end up in the private sector. That is why we ask for a moral commitment to stay in the public sector for at least 2 years after the end of the program. Moreover, during the selection process, we try to select people that really want to serve their country and really believe in it, people with a patriotic sense. Finally, of course, they may end up in the private sector, but as well as they will be a part of our alumni network, we reckon that they will be able to exchange and help other fellows. But we are well aware that low salary in public administration is a problem. Even in Western countries, talented senior civil servants are recruited by the private sector. It's not an issue just in Africa. But anyway, as we said earlier, due to a lack of financial capacity, the private sector is going to be decisive in infrastructure in Africa. And the fellow will have to interact with them in their institution, in their own country. And we believe that involving the private sector is the best way to train them to be in the best position to negotiate and defend the interests of their country. This mutual discovery paradoxically allows civil servants to be also realistic about the profitability of a project and not to dissuade potential investors by being too greedy about the future income that could be generated. We are all aware that an hostile environment of the administration and politics contributes largely to the abandonment of many projects. Anyway, that there are two worlds that are bound to meet each other, and with or without us, some will move from the private and the public sector and vice versa during their career. In the end, I think that this will at least have the quality of allowing the world system to become more competent.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pierre. Now I'm going to move to the questions because we have so many. I'll try to post them on the stage. So the first question is from Mark Mosley about the World Bank studies that Max showed in his presentation. So do you mind, Max, like sharing, maybe later we could like send an email of where these studies could be found on the World Bank website?
Yes, yeah, very happy to.
Yes. Now the second question from Jyoti is about the information gap among the high-income countries. Max, do you mind taking this?
Yes, I assume this question was looking at discussing the learning outcomes in different countries. I mean, education systems are incredibly complex. There's not a kind of easy answer as to why there is the learning gap that exists across different countries, across different sort of income groupings of countries. I think there's a few things I will say. There's underfunding of education. So there is this massive gap to the funding that's needed in order to ensure there's the right teachers, the right schools, the right education and development for those working in the education profession. But there's also, and as I was alluding to in my presentation, there is a challenge whereby a lot of the money that is being spent in education is not being spent in an efficient way. It's not being targeted towards the activities, the interventions that deliver the highest outcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Max. Now, we have a question about the political risks in developing countries and the negative impact to results and implementation of PPPs. Syria, do you want to explain a little bit about the challenge to resolve future PPP developments?
Yes. The question is very general.
Yeah.
So I cannot go into that level of generalities, but what I have observed through the studies on PPP for skills development in, say, transition countries is that these PPPs are often initiated by the actors themselves, and even more frequently by the private sector. So in contexts where there is a genuine need for skills, for upgrading skills, for reskilling people, for training young generations in skills for the future needs of the labor market, then the initiative of the stakeholders, very often the private sector, but also the public sector, matters a lot. And this was independent on the, say, more general political context. Elements that matters, or say traditions that influence these decisions, have to do with what type of prior experience there exists in terms of cooperation between public and private, or even social partnership when it goes to vocational education and training, skills development. So what type of prior experience do public and private stakeholders have? Another important preconditions is the legal environment. Are these PPPs allowed? Are they legitimate? Are they legal? There is no need very often for a dedicated legislation on PPPs, because we are not talking about a big procurement contracts for infrastructure. We are talking about other type of collaboration. And therefore, but nonetheless, some norms must be there. So there are preconditions indeed. About the political risk, I think this goes now a bit beyond perhaps our conversation. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess we need to stop here because we're almost done. We have like one minute left. I want to thank you for joining me today. It was a very interesting discussion, and thanks for the audience. And I just want to say a few words from me as a WAPPP member of the executive committee and also the head of the Young Professional Chapter. I believe that we need to take action and assist in being a part of this capacity building and skills development program, not only in the PPP field, but I mean, we all can assist in somehow due to our professional experience and our education. So this is some sort of invitation to everyone here. I mean, we have WAPPP members and non-WAPPP, so please go to our website, and we're happy to have you as active members, and maybe we could really work on this initiative for, I mean, the whole youth around the world. Thanks again. I'm extremely happy to be having this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jinan, and bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Jinan. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.